I'm back. I don't know what happened. I don't know why that cut off when it did. But anyway, just picking up where I left off with the Sandel. Um, so he is arguing that we need to have an appreciation of the giftedness of life. And he acknowledges that it's a kind of religious sensibility, but he also wants to give an account of it that goes beyond religion. And in that sense, he's engaged in exactly the same kind of project that Core Diamond was engaged in. So there's this question, right? Is he giving us a solution to the problem of impiety? He doesn't put it that way. He doesn't talk in terms of piety, but I think that's exactly what he's on about in this book. We are squarely in the realm of piety and impiety. Um, Now, with respect to sport, I know you're probably thinking, what really does sports have to do with medical ethics? Um, I think for Sandel, this is an issue that goes beyond medical ethics. It certainly is an issue for medical ethics, but it goes well beyond it. And so, in order to make his case, he wants to look at aspects of life beyond medicine, just to prove a point within it. So now we're looking at sports, and what he argues again as a normative claim, really a claim about the essence of sports, is that sports honors the cultivation of natural talent. That yes, of course, sports involves a lot of effort and hard work and determination and grit, but that it's not just about that, right? And we all know it's not just about that. Nobody thinks that sports is really fair in the sense that nobody thinks everybody has a fair shot, right, at being an NFL quarterback. Um, it, it you have to have a certain kind of body, a certain kind of physique, and that would just be something that is given to you. Also, for a quarterback, a certain level of intelligence. Um, so he thinks that what sports does is it honors the cultivation, the hard work, the determination that goes into making these natural talents into something that is truly excellent. He has a really interesting discussion about the difference between spectacle and sport. So he thinks that if we embrace enhancement and engineering, then sports will stop being sports and become mere spectacle. He doesn't give us an exact account of what a spectacle is, but it's really clear that it's supposed to be tied to so the contrast between spectacle is sport, and it's really clear that in the case of sports, the object of our admiration and appreciation is the skills that are meant to call forth and display the sorts of natural talents and abilities that he thinks that we're admiring when we admire athletes. And the contrast here is with spectacle. So spectacle, he says, has to do with kind of like exaggerated features of a sport. He thinks that they're primarily attention grabbing, they're artificial. I was trying to think of good spectacles. I think probably, um, you know, wrestling, sort of the World Wrestling Federation, or something like a slam dunk contest, right? I love watching a slam dunk contest. It's fun, it's exciting, but it's not the same. It's not a sport, right? It's a spectacle. It's just sort of trying to see who can have the most amazing, spectacular slam dunks. And of course, if we think about wrestling, those men and women are obviously athletes, but it's not really their athleticism that's really central. It's more about entertainment, and I think they're very upfront about that. So anyway, he thinks that enhancement is going to change sports so that it becomes spectacle. And again, I think he's making a claim about the essence of sport, and um, he wants to bring it back to this general problem of freedom and responsibility and praise and blame, right? So he thinks that it's good that we praise athletes. Sports are good. They are a fundamental part of our society. I mean, we're all going through a period now where there's no sports. And for a lot of people, including certainly in my household, where March Madness is a way of life, this is very sad, very very sad. Um, so I'm with Sandel here. I'm not one of those academics that is poo pooing sports. I love sports. Um, I love watching sports in particular. So I think he's onto something about the value of sports. So the question is whether or not you think enhancement really takes away from our practices or fundamentally alters our practice of assigning praise and blame to athletic actions. So that is chapter 2. Chapter 3, which is called Designer Children and Parents, has to do with the way that he thinks that genetic engineering and enhancement might fundamentally alter the parent-child relationship in ways that he clearly thinks are bad, right? So he thinks that's something really important and essential about parenting will be lost, and he's worried about that. So this is page 45, beginning of chapter 3. He writes the following: To appreciate children as gifts is to accept them as they come, not as objects of our design or products of our will or instruments of our ambition. Parental love is not contingent on the talents and attributes the child happens to have. We choose our friends and spouses, at least partly on the basis of qualities we find attractive, but we do not choose our children. Their qualities are unpredictable, and even the most conscientious parents cannot be held wholly responsible for the kind of child they have. So again, we come back to this issue of freedom and responsibility. If I design my children rather than just accept them as they come, then I am more deeply responsible for how they turn out because I specified how I wanted them to be. And of course, so I can be criticized for the choices that I make. Whereas if I just leave it to chance, leave it to nature, if I'm, as he says, open to the unbidden, then, my child is who he or she is. And obviously, my job as a parent is to take this child, who has a certain kind of personality, certain talents, certain abilities, certain challenges, and help them to live a good, flourishing human life. So when Sandel is talking about the parent-child relationship, he says there are two aspects of it, right? So parental love has two fundamental aspects for Sandel. There is accepting love. So that's what I've been talking about, being open to the unbidden. Parents are supposed to unconditionally love their children, accept them for who they are. So obviously I have hopes and dreams for my kids. I have some idea of how I want them to turn out, but suppose that from my perspective, it's just an absolute disaster. They don't all turn out the way that I want them to. I'm still supposed to love them, right? And I think that I would rightfully be criticized if I stopped loving my kids because I don't know, they ended up in jail or just not successful or whatever, or even kind of like if they turn out to kind of be bad people, I'm still supposed to love them. So there's accepting love as fundamental to parenthood, but then there's also what he calls transforming love, right? So, right, I mean, you have a kid, well, you have a baby. You don't actually give birth to a kid, you give birth to a baby. And it can't do anything for itself. It's very needy. Human beings are especially needy, vulnerable creatures. It takes a long time for a human to start doing stuff for itself. Um, and so the job of the parent is to help the child become independent. Really, like one of the main jobs of being a parent is to help a child become an independent, practical reasoner so they can like go out in the world and, make it. Well, not just make it, but flourish, right? Now, I take the view, the philosophical view, that the central job here is to cultivate virtue in your children insofar as you can, right? So you want to give them the stable dispositions of character that they're going to need to want and appreciate the things that constitute their flourishing as a human being. That's all part of transforming love, right? You're trying to shape and mold a child to become a certain kind of person, namely a person who is prudent and just and courageous, temperate, generous, etc. So, so it's both, right? There has to be a balance between accepting love and transforming love, and he thinks the problem with enhancement is that the transforming love overtakes accepting love in the parent child relationship. And so the balance that is necessary for this relationship to be the way that it ought to be, right? It's the balance is off, right? So the scales are tipped in favor of transforming love, and he thinks this is a problem. Um, he connects this to pride or hubris. So he thinks that parents, when they act in such a way as to design their children, they're really trying to force their children to be a certain way. What way is that? The way that they want them to be, right? So now it's all about the parents' will. And yeah, maybe this is a threat to the child's autonomy. But he's actually not very impressed with this sort of argument because he thinks that, I mean, look, parenting isn't really about protecting a kid's autonomy, right? You can't transform or shape a child in a certain way if you're too worried about their precious autonomy. So that's not really the central argument for him. The central argument for him, not surprisingly, is the hubris or the pride that lies behind what he calls the drive to master the mystery of birth. So if you look at page 46 and 47, he writes the following. The problem lies in the hubris of the designing parents and their drive to master the mystery of birth. Even if this disposition does not make parents tyrants to their children, it disfigures the relation between parent and child and deprives the parent of the humility and enlarged human sympathies that an openness to the unbidden can cultivate. Even strenuous attempts to treat or cure diseases do not constitute a Promethean assault on the given. The reason is that medicine is governed, or at least guided, by the norm of restoring and preserving the natural human functions that constitute health. So he doesn't have an issue, and this is a theme in the book, he doesn't have an issue with trying to eradicate disease. He has a problem with enhancement. And he goes over arguments that people, so some medical ethicists have actually argued that parents have an obligation to enhance their kids, right? So the argument is roughly this: well, look, everybody expects parents to give their kids the best that they can give them. So if it turns right, so I don't just want to give my kid food, but I want to give them healthy food. I don't want to just give my kids an education. I want to give them the best education that I can provide to them, etc. Um, so similarly, I don't want to just leave. I don't want to just leave it to the genetic lottery how they turn out. I want to give them the best opportunity to flourish in life. So obviously, I should select those traits that are going to allow them to be the most successful. Um, he resists this. He thinks there is no such obligation. And even more than that, he thinks that the very idea of enhancing or designing children is a threat to the parent child relationship. And he goes through cases of hyperparenting. Um, Probably this phenomenon is more or less familiar to you. Certainly, a lot of students that I have are products of what I would call hyperparenting. Um, and so he also talks about the ADHD epidemic, which is something that we talked about in previous lectures, and he connects that to hyperparenting. Um, so again, just to summarize, in this chapter, we have another fundamental aspect of human life that he thinks is directly threatened by enhancement, and that he connects to an assault on, what does he say? The mystery of birth and the giftedness of life, right? You should obviously be thinking to yourself, this is the stuff of piety. Okay, so now we move on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the chapter on eugenics. And a lot of this chapter just reviews very, very briefly the history of eugenics. If you're interested in that history, there's a wonderful book called Imbeciles by Adam Cohen. And I actually, on the PowerPoint, I put up an article in The Atlantic by Adam Cohen that was a response to a Supreme Court opinion, a dissenting opinion written by Justice Clarence Thomas, in which he argued that abortion is being used as a kind of eugenics, right? That we standardly in medical practice identify genetic abnormalities, and then we allow couples to abort because of a perceived genetic abnormality. And, you know, he just argues, well, this is obviously eugenics. And it seems to me that Sandel absolutely agrees with Clarence Thomas on this point. So we, I want to go over why he would say that that's the case. And it's interesting to look at Cohen's response, and whether or not you think his response is adequate, or whether he's just defining things in such a way that nothing but historical eugenics could be eugenics. Obviously, Sandel takes a different view. But generally, the history of eugenics, like the very short version of the history of eugenics, is that it's a movement that began in Great Britain in the late 19th century. And it was all the rage in the United States in the early to mid 20th century, until Hitler, right? So Hitler was a eugenicist. The best way to understand Hitler and Hitler's racial policies in Germany is that he was a very committed eugenicist. So he wanted a pure Aryan race. That was at the center of his vision for a Third Reich, kind of imperial German um, Europe. And the difference between Hitler and people in the United States and Great Britain was that he was willing to enact a eugenicist policy on a pretty dramatic, large scale. So he was obviously willing to kill millions, to murder millions of unfit Europeans. So this was a commitment to eugenics. Eugenics is just basically the idea that we ought to cultivate good stock, right? So obviously we do this with animals. We breed animals so that they will have certain characteristics. What characteristics? The ones we want, right? So we do this all the time. Um, and the eugenicists come along and they're like, well, look, I mean, why wouldn't we do this with us? Right? I mean, why are we just like leaving it to chance? We should obviously breed the best sorts of humans. Um, Now, people nowadays will say, okay, well, look, old school eugenics was bad because it was involuntary. So I gave the example of Hitler. I mean, that's very extreme, but even in the United States, as Sandel points out, um, our Supreme Court ruled that people could and should be involuntarily sterilized because they were unfit to reproduce, right? So there's the very famous Buck v. Bell Supreme Court opinion. And that sort of thing, involuntary sterilization, went on for a while in the United States, all the way until the early 70s, in fact, in some states. So that's just a part of our history. Now, people will come along today and say, yeah, okay, but so that was bad. I mean, most people think eugenics was bad, um, especially after what the Nazis did. Nobody, there are very few really open eugenicists hanging around. But people will say, well, look, why was it bad? Because it wasn't voluntary, right? So it was violating autonomy, and we just all know that that's bad. But we can imagine a different regime, which is marked by non coercive, um, non coercive, voluntary selection, right? So, which in fact is what happens now, right? So if 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 you're pregnant and someone identifies any kind of genetic abnormality um, up to, well, depending on the state where you live, but up to a certain point, you can just get an abortion. Um, and we know that fetuses are aborted for all kinds of non medical reasons. Um, so right? Because it's not the sex that the couple desired, because maybe it has some kind of chromosomal deficiencies. So 92% of fetuses with Down syndrome are aborted. There are countries like Iceland, which brags about having eradicated Down syndrome, and that, of course, is done through elective abortion. So Sandel is going to say that this is a form of eugenics, right? Um, and he thinks that we should be pretty worried about this, actually.